we're joined in our virtual studio by Justin Callais. He's the chief economist for the Archbridge Institute. Justin, welcome to Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having me on, Nick.
Justin, I'm excited to have you back. You've been on the show before. I think it was actually when Archbridge came out with the Social Mobility Index report a few years ago that essentially you guys have these amazing metrics where you go through and you rank every state in the nation in terms of their upward social mobility to really kind of figure out where are things going really well, where do we need some improvement. And I want to ask you to give an overview of the report, kind of within this context that I think we often talk about upward mobility policy or opportunity policy at the federal level, thinking, well, what can the federal government do? The thing that's great about the data that you all bring to the table is there's actually a lot of variability at the state level, which suggests to me that there's a lot that states could actually do, or a lot of things that could be done at the state level to increase upward mobility for folks trying to escape poverty. So I want to sort of maybe articulate that broad principle of I really want states to embrace their role as leaders and innovators in policies that can boost upward mobility. And data from the Archbridge Institute helps us have those conversations. So with that kind of overlay, you guys have a new report out. It's new numbers showing the best and worst states for upward mobility. First, can you just kind of give us the overview, the report, the findings, what stood out to you? Give us kind of the 30,000-foot summary.
No, absolutely, and I think you're absolutely correct in to say that states can be leaders in mobility, and states can still be. This is why we have federalist policies within the federal government and states, is that states still have a lot of frameworks in which they can provide different policy ideas and provide different laboratories of democracy that allows for the different policies and testing to see what works, what doesn't. So I think with respect to this report, what we find again is that there's vast differences between the top performing state, which is Utah, and the bottom performing state, which is unfortunately my home state of Louisiana. Much like in the first edition, but what we see is that there has been a lot of movement within mobility across the states, and there was a few different kind of data changes that we made. So some of it's attributed to that, but a lot of it is still due to fundamental policy changes that have been made over the last few years. So, for example, you see Idaho, a bordering state, that's moved up 11 spots from 16th to 5th in the last from one edition to the other. You see similar movements in Tennessee, South Carolina, Colorado, and Arizona. They've also moved up between 5 and 7 spots as well. And obviously, if some states are moving up, this means some states must be moving down. And we're seeing states like Minnesota, for example, which was second last year, drop to 9th. Oklahoma and New Jersey both fell down 6 spots. And Oregon fell down about 8 or 9 spots. And Rhode Island fell down 11 spots. So overall, what we see is the top 5 performing states are states that did really well at social mobility in the last report, and generally have either improved or, in the case of Utah, stayed number 1 from one edition to the other. So you see Utah, Vermont, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho are the top 5 states. The bottom 5 states are, I believe, the exact same from last report, which was Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, New York, and Arkansas. So what you're seeing is that there's still, there's huge variability between states like Utah, Montana, Idaho, to states like Louisiana, Alabama, New York, that still have a lot of room to grow. And I think, again, this is one of the great things about having state-based policies, is that they're nimbler, they can move more quickly, can try more innovation than something like what DC tends to do. And obviously what the federal government does matters for all states across the board, but states still play a huge role in making marginal changes across different pillars and across different points in one's life that can make it either provide for more opportunities or provide erect more barriers to mobility.
Justin, you make a good point, because what you said, that obviously federal policy matters, and I would agree. Federal policy matters tremendously when it comes to opportunity and upward mobility and helping people get out of poverty and kind of move up in their efforts to realize the American dream. I think one of my hopes from conversations like this is that we can make what happens in Washington, D.C. a little bit less essential to upward mobility in the state. So that if I'm in a given state and I say, well, I want my state to have better upward mobility, essentially I should have more power to improve that at the state level rather than having to go to Washington and try and change things there. So there is a federal policy component to this that I hope we can angle towards. Let's move more of this decision making to the states, whatever currently is sort of at the federal level, empower the states more. And in that context, as you mentioned, the top 5 states, Utah, Vermont, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, if I'm getting those top 5 right, those are all essentially kind of Intermountain West states, except for Vermont. That was interesting to me. Is there something, maybe Vermont is the outlier of doing really well, though it's on the other side of the country? What do those 5 states have in common? Obviously, with Utah still number 1, what makes those states do so well, and why is it, do you think, they're all Mountain West states except for Vermont? That was really interesting to me.
Yeah, so I think one thing that stands out between all of the top performers is that they do pretty well on every single of the 4 pillars. So we have these 4 pillars of mobility that are the environment for entrepreneurship and economic growth. This is something you're seeing a lot of momentum in Utah and Montana and Wyoming and Idaho to bring more business to the area, to bring more opportunities to the area, through easier entrepreneurial regulations, um, usually a more lax tax policy. So you're seeing a lot of the momentum kind of happen in those states. And I think one of the reasons why you're seeing, some of the movements in states kind of happen regionally is because states are competing with one another, right? This is the idea that, you're seeing this in the Gulf South as well with respect to income taxes, for example. So you have Texas and Florida, that have zero income tax. And now what you're seeing is all these within the Gulf South, people are moving and, voting with their feet to those different places for, they're moving from Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama to places like Florida and Texas. So what do you see? You see Tennessee also adopt a zero income tax, and you're seeing even states that haven't made it zero. You're still seeing states like Louisiana and Mississippi to try to make their tax codes more competitive in the region in which they're competing. And I think another aspect to that is going back to the top 5 states, specifically them being in the mountain region, is that they all again are competing with one another, but they also have the advantages of good education policy and good education quality. They're also tend to be more community bonded than many of the other states because they're states that there's usually not a lot of out migration from those areas. I think that's one of the more interesting findings from the report is that if you look at the states that perform worst on social capital, for example, they tend to be states that have a lot of out migration. I think one of the reasons for that is because if communities are, you have a community from where you're born, and people tend, the vast majority of people tend to live within, a radius of where they grew up in. However, if the policies in those areas don't make it to where you can flourish or reach your full potential of the American dream in those areas, you have to then move. But what happens? You see people moving from those areas, and therefore, you're seeing basically those bonds and those connections leave with them. So people are leaving, places like Illinois and Louisiana and New York, which tend to score pretty lowly on social capital because those community bonds are leaving over to another state.
Justin, one of the things I hear sometimes, because I find myself in a lot of national conversations about poverty and upward mobility and policies that strengthen opportunity. And Utah has had this ranking as the best state in the nation for upward mobility for quite a while. Your previous version of the report ranked Utah at the top. This one does too. It's gratifying to see Utah kind of maintain that top spot. There's other data from Raj Chetty and the team at Harvard, the Opportunity Insights Project, that sees incredibly high rates of upward mobility in Utah and in the Salt Lake metro area in particular. So a lot of different sources basically saying there's something really good going on here in Utah. Sometimes when those conversations come up nationally, I hear folks say, well, Utah is just unique. It's an outlier. We can't do that. And so I want to ask you, again, I would push back on those folks a little bit, say there actually are things you can do at a state level. There is decision-making that happens in your state that has a strong impact on upward mobility. And I want to ask you kind of what are those things? Maybe another way of asking is, what do you hope policymakers will do with this information, especially for states that want to see their rankings improve, or states like Utah or the others in the top 5 where we obviously want to maintain what we have and build upon it? And so what would you say to policymakers in the various states of, well, here's actually the kinds of things you can do on a state level to strengthen upward mobility. It's not this mystical, well, we just can't do anything about it. It is the way it is. They can make a difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think with respect to, what policy changes or what policymakers can do is one, take advantage of the advantages that each state brings to the table, right? So if you look at a state like Louisiana versus Texas, both of them have natural resource advantages being in the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America, um, next to each other, but they have vastly different outcomes. Why? It's because Louisiana didn't take advantage of those resources to the extent that Texas did. Texas has a lot of policies that they're obviously not perfect, right? They rank fairly lowly for on social mobility for other reasons, but they took the advantages that are given to them and made it an attractive place for people to want to move and people want to live. Similarly with Utah, right? So Utah obviously has beautiful scenery. It's a very community bonded area. It's a very attractive place to live, but you also then have to take advantage of those resources that you have, or those advantages that you have. In doing so, that means making it a place where people don't want to leave. So, for example, if you look at other states that have those types of natural advantages, like California, New York has had for a long period of time been places for business and innovation, and many of the policies that they've chosen since then, have made those places worse to do business and worse for people to afford to live in those areas. And all those policies push people away, right? So that, they have these advantages in their state that they have, and that they have kind of let dwindle away by not taking advantage of them, and further realizing what got them there in the first place. I think one thing, with respect to policymakers that can be useful for this index is that it's pretty bipartisan in nature. I think, to kind of paint with a broad brush at least, there's some advantages that red states tend to do better on in social mobility, and things that blue states tend to do better on. This isn't a perfect, every red state does better than every blue state, but red states tend to do better on regulation, tax policy, education freedom, and school choice. You're seeing a lot of momentum there, and housing regulations. So you see, for example, Texas particularly, Houston and Austin have been places that a lot of people have moved to, but they've also allowed for more building of new construction, which has made, kind of the increase in demand from people wanting to live there has not coincided with this massive increase in cost of living, because they've allowed for new buildings to be built. On the on more blue states, they tend to do better. This isn't perfect, but they tend to do better on legal systems and having less predatory state action. You obviously see some outliers with respect to Illinois and New York and New Jersey, for example. But generally speaking, like a state like Vermont tends to do pretty well in their legal system quality, and that's one of the major, I think, barriers that places have in addressing business activity and people moving to the state and businesses moving to the state. This, I think, is one thing that Louisiana really struggles with, is because they have this kind of unique legal system. It makes it very costly for people to move, for businesses to set up shop in Louisiana if they're already used to a certain system elsewhere. So that makes it a lot more difficult for businesses and people to move to Louisiana, just because the legal system quality is different and usually for the worst. So I think there's things that both people on the left and right can learn from one another here. I think there's one of the great things, speaking of Utah, that Governor Cox does, is that he's kind of been a champion among Republican governors of having conversations with governors on the left who, they obviously don't agree on everything politically, but they find, I think I believe I saw this quote from the Oklahoma governor that, oh, well, in DC, they get to play politics and yell at each other, and, they're pretty removed from everyday life. But if you're a local leader in your state or at your county, well, you live in the area, you're around people there all the time. They're relying on you to actually make their lives better. So there's things people can learn from one another that, can obviously, if you do that correctly, can improve mobility along the way.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description, and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.